How impressive is seeing such a dominant season in modern motorsports, which seems to be more focused on closer racing and parity among the teams?
Joe, I've got to say it's very, very impressive. As you mentioned, modern motorsports, they've been focusing more on closer racing and parity among the teams, and I'm all for that. Seeing the closer racing and seeing real competitions happen and races, it's definitely more interesting. But looking at Max Verstappen's dominant season, it's just, even if you root for another team or even if you don't like Red Bull in particular, seeing his dominant season, you just can't think of anything else but awe for Max Verstappen and just recognize how impressive this feat is. So, while I personally would like to see more closer racing, which I'm hoping for in the next season, I've just got to hand it to Max Verstappen and congratulate him for putting up such a dominant performance this whole season.
I think it's really interesting that with Formula One specifically, all the money that goes into it, the millions upon millions of dollars, that you still get teams, like one single team, to dominate in this way, especially right now with how Red Bull is dominating. It's just really interesting because you would think with all the money that all these teams have that it would be a bit closer, but it's just not like that. And you look at IndyCar as well. I mean, Alex Palou did something kind of similar, not nearly in the same way as Max Verstappen's just winning nearly every single race. But I mean, even in that, all the cars are very equal. But Palou would manage to pull that off as well over there. But with Max Verstappen, these cars are so technical and there's so much money going into them. I've always found it just very interesting with F1 how there's always a driver or a team that's just so dominant. But now, Max Verstappen's just a whole other level. It's very impressive.
I think it's important to realize, Alex and company, that yes, we have had teams running away with the championship a lot more in the past 2 years, but we've had so much more people finishing on the podium, which is exactly what this intended. I feel like overall we've had a fairly competitive on-track package with F1, and you would hope that, you would have more fighting up front. And I think all we can really do right now is hope that in the next couple of years, Red Bull doesn't just run away with it with the next couple of years. Although, as much as Adrian Newey is dominating, it's hard for me to argue that's not going to happen. I think one thing's for certain: it sucks as a fan right now to see one guy win every single race. But 5-10 years on, we're going to look back at this and be like, this is something cool. This is something absolutely awesome that we're going to be able to say that we got to experience. Ben.
You're right, Jackson. But in the moment, in the here and the now, it's very, very frustrating. And that's not to take anything away from Max Verstappen or from Red Bull, but this just feels different for some reason. Like we've seen, like Lewis Hamilton did this in the beginning of this turbo hybrid era, but I feel like at least he had Nico Rosberg, and Rosberg even won a championship. And then Ferrari started flexing their muscles a little bit. If I still believe if certain things had gone differently, Sebastian Vettel could be a 6-time world champion. I think he let 2017 get away from him. I think he let 2018 get away from him. Michael Schumacher even had Rubens Barrichello to a certain extent. I know he was on the podium every race in 2002. I know he won something ridiculous like 12 of the first 13 and 4 or something like that. And Max has won 14 of the last 15 here, but the season was just so perfectly encapsulated today with that first corner and Sergio Perez and the conversations that we were having going into this year is, can Checo take the fight to Max? Can he truly be that Nico Rosberg and be somebody who, in a year where we know this car is going to dominate and win almost every single race, can he truly challenge Max Verstappen, who's shaping up to end up being one of the greatest of all time by the time he steps away and retires? Can he fight for the world championship? And after a couple of races, he won 2 of the first 5 races this year. I think it's easy to forget that. We thought we might be seeing that. And then Max went on his run, and just all throughout the year, particularly when we got into the summer months, I know he's still second in a championship. He might not be for much longer. Lewis Hamilton's coming, and if he hadn't been disqualified, they'd be about even from the Coda race here. The points that he lost from that. There's just, and I told you guys backstage before we came on, the last several years, as I continue to get more disillusioned with the playoff format and what's happening in NASCAR and the direction that sport has been heading, I've really found myself much more invested in Formula One just from a fan's perspective. Of course, I still follow NASCAR, still commentate on it for this program and everything. But, just thinking back to the last several years, if there's a NASCAR and F1 race going head to head, most times I'm going to pick the F1 race. That's just where I am in terms of my interest right now. As soon as the first corner happened, I had the F1 race on my laptop on in the background, but, I'm the guy that has anti-playoff activist in my Twitter bio. And I was solely focused on the Martinsville race today because at least there are some storylines there and it's not a foregone conclusion who's going to win. I mean, Max has already clinched the championship. He's, won almost every race except for Singapore since, May? I mean, it's just very frustrating to watch that as a viewer. But again, at the end of the day, like you mentioned, Jackson, we are going to look back on this and look at him as one of the greatest of all time. Look at this as one of the greatest seasons of all time. But in the moment, it is incredibly frustrating to watch. And you hope that going into 2024, but you can see Mercedes and Ferrari, maybe even McLaren, maybe even Aston Martin can recapture that magic they had at the start of the year and challenge Red Bull, because the sport has a lot of momentum right now, particularly here in the United States, the boom and the growth that it's seen over the last few years here in this country. If it's a foregone conclusion, if you know who's going to win almost every weekend, what's the point in watching? And I think a lot of newer fans in particular are going to be asking that question as this dominance continues.
And I think that's what's really kind of almost humiliating for Formula One, where in the year where it seems like we have the most eyes on this sport, we have just a year where one driver has just ran away with it all. And that being said, it's still awesome to see like random people who you would never expect be like, oh, that's Max Verstappen. But it's just, I wish the on-track product would be so much better.
Imagine if 2021 was your first season as an F1 fan.
And for so many people, it was.
How incredible that was. And I know Abu Dhabi got very messy at the end and kind of put a damper on things. But the battle that we saw between Lewis and Max all year, and you get invested in that, you watch that, you think this must be what this sport is. And the last 2 years, and this year in particular, I mean, you find out that that's not the reality. And I think that's, if you're a newer fan and you don't have the historical context that we all have here, I think that's got to be very frustrating.
Yeah, definitely very, very frustrating, Ben. I think you've all pretty much summarized what I wanted to say, so I don't really have much to add. But I definitely want to tip my hat to Max Verstappen, Red Bull, for the incredible season that they've had. But like you guys were saying, from a viewer standpoint, is extremely frustrating to try to watch these Formula One races. And I'll be honest, when I come on these shows to talk about Formula One, I read a bunch of articles and look at the highlights package because I don't even see. It's not even worth it to wake up early to watch these races. Because watch them live, because I already know who's going to win. It's going to be Max Verstappen in 2021 when we had the epic championship battle between Hamilton and Verstappen. That was the first time I actually saw the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix live, because I'm typically still asleep at that time because I'm a night owl. I was very invested in Formula One in 2021. I mean, I'm still invested in it, but obviously not as much. But like you guys were saying, looking into the future, hopefully we can get back into a better state of parity where it won't be Red Bull running away with it. Maybe we can get Mercedes back up there, Ferrari. Hopefully McLaren can do something, because it seems like they have a great thing going with them. And like you were saying also about Aston Martin, maybe they can rediscover that early season magic, because they've been absolutely nowhere in the second half of the season. I missed the times, when we had a Pierre Gasly winning the Italian Grand Prix. We had Esteban Ocon winning his first race. When you saw Daniel Ricciardo in a McLaren winning at Monza, those type of races where you get an unexpected race winner.
I'll say this before we move on to the rest of our grid ranking stuff, but I think Formula One has a very big opportunity here for 2025 to make some big changes before we get to those next big set of reg changes in 2026. And I'm not saying, oh, let's just throw away the next couple of seasons and get hyped for 2026, but it's almost interesting, right? When we have cars that were purposely built to have closer wheel-to-wheel racing, and we've had this level of dominance. And you've got to give your hands off to Adrian Newey, who's, found the secret sauce. But it's sad that in the past couple of years, it's just been the team that kind of finds the key to good pace early, just runs away with it.
Something interesting, because we're talking about dominant drivers. A question from the chat room: do you think Max's season was way more impressive than Shane Van Gisbergen's 2022 season, or just slightly.
That's a Joe and Kobe question.
I would say this. Last year, Shane Van Gisbergen over 19 wins in the Supercar series was very dominant. And I kept raising the question, is the competition just dropping the ball on Triple Eight Racing Shane Van Gisbergen? And it's starting to make me wonder, do you feel the F1 teams really drop the ball and bring in a competitive car this year and just enable Red Bull to just run away with it? Because I feel like this year has just been, no matter where Verstappen is, he's going to put himself in the top 5 or the podium.
I'll tell you what, it might be a mentality of, excuse me, it might be a mentality of, okay, if Red Bull's already getting this championship, let's just give up. I don't want to say give up, but let's pump the brakes on development for this year and focus on making a better car for next year. And I think a lot of teams this year are kind of putting their chips in that basket because they're realizing just how much of a dynasty Red Bull could be here for the rest of this kind of regulation era. So I am hoping that the rest of these teams really step up to Red Bull. But again, we're just gonna have to wait until Bahrain next year.
Yeah, well, and again, talking about it feeling different than it's felt. I mean, we saw Sebastian Vettel win 4 straight championships with Red Bull, and Red Bull win 4 straight constructors championships with him. But people forget, like 2010 was an amazing championship battle. 2012 was an amazing
2012,
battle.
fantastic.
You had 7 winners in the first 7 races. 7 different winners in the first 7 races in 2012. 8 total that season. Pastor Maldonado won a race in the Williams, for crying out loud. To this day, Williams' only victory, I believe, since 2004. I mean, that's the kind of parity I want to get back to. I understand what makes those seasons so special and so magical is that, that's not the norm, but they don't happen all the time. But when they do, I mean, it is a much better feeling just watching it as a viewer, watching it as a fan, that that there are 3, 4, maybe 5 different teams that have 2 drivers that could win on any given Sunday, depending on the track conditions, depending on which track suits which car the best. And here we are in 2023, and we get this. And again, Singapore being the lone Achilles heel for Red Bull and for Max Verstappen, the winner every other week, the last 15 races, has been a foregone conclusion as soon as you enter the track for FP1 on Friday.